I must tell you that on Thursday I flew out of Cape Town's new international airport. I promise you, and I go to many airports, it is an outstanding airport. It has tripled or quadrupled in size. It's got magnificent architecture. The process has flowed smoothly. And last night, as you know, I left ORT, Oliver Tambo, and Oliver Tambo is the size of Schiphol. And it functioned, and I flew through there, and zap, it's extraordinary. It produces this kind of seed of really what's possible, what is alive in us. So I would never have thought that this small little nation, we don't realize how small the country is. It's less than a third of the world's economic activity. There's a game, I don't know if any of you, how many of you come from Cape Town? Hands up. That's cool. And how many of you had a bad youth misspent on pinball? Less of you. Come on, let's have a real show. Admit the truth, guys. In Japan, there's a game called pachinko. It's sort of like a pinball equivalent. The turnover of pachinko in Japan is bigger than the South African economy. We're a small economy, but we fight above our weight. So I'm kind of intrigued about that. And who would have thought we'd be hosting this event? The stadiums in Greenpoint and Joburg and Soweto are astonishing. They are magnificent. They've been finished ahead of schedule. And we love over-criticizing, but actually every now and then we just produce this magnificent kind of performance. And I'm inspired by that. I'm sure you are too, in rugby, in cricket, in business, in artistic life. South Africans take their place all across the world, including in this amazing city, minus the weather. On an economic front, of course, it's hard to say how things will go. We can say that it is the anchor state of the African economy. And it's easy to lose track of the fact that South Africa sits at the end of a continent which is very clearly the next frontier of economic development. Anyone who doesn't understand that hasn't got to grips with 1 billion people. 1 billion people in a continent full of resources, full of unleveraged opportunity, full of incredible cultures. And it's got to come. It's coming. South African companies, of course, have gone into Africa on a scale that I think would make the Chinese blush. We've moved in telecommunications, in entertainment, in so many, in mining, in banking, in retail. South African companies have moved into Africa. And the great opportunities from the anchor state of South Africa are these enormous countries of Ghana, Nigeria, Sudan, and Ethiopia. And in spite of all the challenges of governance, of administration, the fact is it's 1 billion people. And China and India, South Africa, multinationals have realized this is where great resources of the 21st century lie. So there's going to be a lot of action around that. This week, the economists upgraded their economic forecast from 2% to 3.5%. 3.5% is still not enough. To overcome the poverty, which is the central question in South Africa, is poverty. 1 in 3 South Africans earns less than $2 a day. That's the central question. It has to get resolved. The only way it will be resolved is through growth, because we know that growth, economic growth, is the oxygen of democracy. Without economic growth, it is very hard to come to terms with our history. And when we look into the mirror and say, who are we must start our conversation around that poverty. It is the central striking feature of South Africa. It has the most unequal income distribution in the world. This is going to change. It is changing. It will change faster the faster we grow. So it's a country whose roots lie in, as we all know, this kind of rather awkward and extraordinary story. When I get up in the morning, I like to think about having 2 things that matter to me, my map and the mirror. And I know that Cheryl will talk later a bit about identity and these kinds of issues, but I love to start our conversation about leadership and what we need to do as a generation of people whose hearts are in the country, whether you live there or not. It is to do with the mirror. Because the mirror is the first start of who am I, and what am I trying to do, and what does my work mean, and what is my life's journey about. And without getting too heavy about it, when we check ourselves in the mirror in South Africa now, the answers are beginning to change. And I think that either you like that change or you don't. I love the change. I relish the idea that the country I come from simply no longer exists. I relish the idea of new identities, of new engagements, of reaching deeply into the many cultures that now make up South Africa. And when I look into the mirror, I ask myself, do I belong in this? Do I want to be in this? And I think whether I come to the UK or go to the States or go anywhere in the world, this is one of the great issues of all time. It's a universal, timeless question. But it's one that has a certain impact in emerging countries right now. We have reached a tipping point. We have reached a point in which the world's attention increasingly moves away from the developed economies of Europe and the United States and Japan, and increasingly towards the rest of the world. Let me just give you some numbers. There are 6.5 billion people on the planet today. In your lifetimes, for most of you, by 2050, there'll be 9.5 billion people on the planet. That raises all sorts of interesting questions. Currently, 70% of the world's economic activity is in Japan, America, and Europe. But 80% of the future growth, with all predictions, will come from the rest of the planet. And the rest of the planet are these enormous societies we are talking about more and more now. China, 1.2 billion people. India, 1.1 billion. Africa, nearly 1 billion. Latin America, Eastern Europe, Russia, and so on. And so the excitement of the next 20, 30 years in this flatter world is how we engage with each other, how we do business with each other, whether we have new ideas and answers to old questions, whether we have new answers to new questions, and the role that we as emerging country people play in shaping the landscape, from climate change to technology to social values. This is the exciting invitation in a global world. And what I see happening in this tipping point is that emerging countries like Brazil, like South Africa, like many of the Asian countries, are finding their voice and saying something different than the voice of Japan, America, and Europe. Which is not to say their voices won't be powerful, because the truth is that America will remain the largest economy in the world well beyond my lifetime. It's a source of great innovation, tremendously interesting culture. It's a dynamic young country, America. It will continue to play that. And Europe will definitely retain its heritage, its sophistication, and all the things it stands for with its multiculturalism. But the rest of the world, Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, this is where the energy, the raw energy of new ideas is going to come from. And I've been privileged, I'm sure many of you have as well, to travel to these countries and understand what these people are about in their DNA, the grittiness, the willingness to please, the hard work, the discipline that makes them so successful. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because this is where South Africa is. We are in this cusping zone. I don't know if it's another 20, 30 years. It doesn't matter too much. But it's a journey that we've embarked on. 1990, 1994 was a turning point. But this journey didn't just begin then. It goes back further than that. And it certainly reaches into the next 20 years where we find our rhythm, where we find we are an African nation, where we find that that is the central issue around us, that we find that in that Africanness there are many identities. I come from a European tradition, but I am an African. In fact, I was talking to the MBA students the other day, and I'd got to know them really well, and I said, "Do you think I'm a white male?" They looked at me and they said, "Of course." I said, "I know, but if I catch you thinking like that, there's going to be trouble." This multiculturalism, this capacity to range across the boundaries, this curiosity in otherness, this digging into our identity that is primarily African, is going to be a joy and celebration for years to come. I may not get caught up in all of it, but the excitement of finding it, of getting that rhythm going, of really feeling like I belong in this place, I think is what being South Africans are going to be about. There are many people in my generation who leave the country. I've never ever criticized it. I think it's an absolute right. We are in a flat world. The world competes for talent. I've never criticized people leaving. I do hope that ones who live in South Africa really contribute to building a different country. But the people I have a struggle with are those who stay and emigrate. And staying and emigrating is a habit of the northern suburbs of Joburg, where I live, and the southern suburbs of Cape Town. It's the capacity to be there but not quite be there. It's the ability to withdraw from otherness and pretend in your little community that you're going to be okay if only we can hang on to. This is not a winning formula.